By 1904, one man controlled 91% of oil refining in the United States. Not a government, not a coalition of businessmen, one individual. His company touched every lamp lit after dark, every factory machine requiring lubrication, every train crossing the continental expanse. The entity he built generated wealth that would equal approximately $400 billion in today's economy, making him the richest American who ever lived. John D. Rockefeller transformed kerosene from a luxury into a necessity, reshaped the industrial landscape of an entire nation, and pioneered business strategies so effective they're still studied in every major business school. He also crushed competitors with calculated precision, manipulated transportation networks, and built a monopoly so absolute that the United States government spent over a decade trying to dismantle it. Standard Oil wasn't just a company. It represented a fundamental shift in how business operated in America. Before Rockefeller, industries consisted of small operations competing on relatively equal footing. After Standard Oil, the age of massive corporate consolidation had arrived, forever altering the balance between commerce and democracy. The story begins not in boardrooms or oil fields, but in a modest wooden house in upstate New York, where a boy learned lessons about money that would shape the economic architecture of modern America. His father, a con man and bigamist, taught him one version of capitalism. His mother, a devout Baptist who scraped by on almost nothing, taught him another. The combination created something unprecedented. What Rockefeller built defied every convention of his era. He entered an industry drowning in chaos, waste, and spectacular failures. Within 2 decades, he had rationalized it into a machine of extraordinary efficiency. He reduced the price of kerosene by 80% while simultaneously accumulating personal wealth that staggered the imagination. Critics called him a robber baron, a ruthless monopolist who exemplified everything wrong with unregulated capitalism. Admirers called him a genius, an organizational mastermind who brought order to pandemonium and made energy affordable for ordinary Americans. The truth sits somewhere more complex than either narrative suggests. This is the story of how Standard Oil dominated America, the deals that built an empire, and the man who proved that in the emerging industrial age, information, logistics, and ruthless efficiency could matter more than invention, resources, or even capital itself. Life beginnings, July 8, 1839. Richford, New York, a farming community where most families measured wealth in acres, livestock, and bushels of grain. In a simple wood frame house, Eliza Davison Rockefeller gave birth to her second child, a son she named John Davison Rockefeller. The scent of kerosene lamps hadn't yet permeated American households. The oil industry didn't exist. The infant born that summer day would create it. Young John's childhood unfolded against a backdrop of instability masked by rural normalcy. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, possessed charm, ambition, and a flexible relationship with truth. William traveled constantly, claiming to work as a merchant, trading in lumber and salt. The reality proved more complicated. He sold dubious cure-all elixirs, posed as a doctor despite no medical training, and maintained a second family in Canada under a false identity. When William returned home, he brought money. When he vanished for months at a time, Eliza struggled to feed 6 children on almost nothing. The contradiction shaped John profoundly. His father embodied swaggering confidence and moral flexibility. William once loaned young John money at 10% interest, then celebrated when his son made the payments on time, declaring he was teaching the boy how capitalism worked. His mother represented the opposite pole, stern piety, rigid self-discipline, and a Baptist faith that viewed earthly pleasures with suspicion. She stretched pennies until they screamed, grew vegetables to supplement scarce meals, and drilled into her children that wastefulness represented both practical foolishness and spiritual failure. John absorbed both lessons. From his father, money is power, agreements are tools, and sentiment has no place in transactions. From his mother, waste nothing, show no excess, let no resource escape productive use. The combination would prove devastatingly effective. By age 7, John was raising turkeys to sell to neighbors. He'd buy the young birds, feed them carefully, calculate his costs to the penny, and negotiate sales with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable. He saved his earnings in a blue porcelain bowl, counting the coins repeatedly, recording every transaction in a small notebook. This wasn't a child's game. Even then, accumulation itself provided satisfaction that transcended whatever the money might buy. In 1853, the family moved to Strongsville, Ohio, near Cleveland. John was 14. The relocation placed him at the edge of tremendous economic transformation. Cleveland sat on Lake Erie, connecting eastern markets to the expanding western territories. Railroads were multiplying, telegraph lines followed. The city hummed with commercial energy, a stark contrast to rural New York. John attended Central High School in Cleveland, where he excelled at mathematics and showed little interest in anything else. He didn't participate in social activities. He didn't pursue athletics. He sat in the back, calculated figures, and thought about money. His classmates found him odd. Teachers noted his intensity, but worried about his narrow focus. One instructor later recalled that John approached every problem as if it were a business transaction, requiring cost-benefit analysis. He left high school in 1855 without graduating. Rather than pursue university, he enrolled in a 10-week course at Folsom's Commercial College, studying bookkeeping, penmanship, and commercial law. The curriculum matched his temperament perfectly: concrete skills, measurable outcomes, direct application to earning money. He absorbed double-entry bookkeeping with particular enthusiasm, recognizing that precise financial records provided power. If you tracked every penny, you understood your business better than competitors who kept information in their heads or on scattered scraps of paper. September 26, 1855. John went looking for work in Cleveland, targeting the city's commission merchants and produce shippers. He was 16 years old, rail-thin, with intense blue eyes that made people uncomfortable. He walked from office to office, requesting positions as a bookkeeper or clerk. Rejection followed rejection. He returned daily, wearing the same dark suit, asking the same questions, refusing to show discouragement. On the 42nd day of searching, Hewitt and Tuttle, a commission merchant dealing in grain, hay, and miscellaneous goods, offered him an assistant bookkeeper position. No salary, initially. They'd evaluate his work and potentially pay him later. John accepted immediately. He started that afternoon, diving into their ledgers with focused intensity. Within 3 months, he'd reorganized their entire accounting system, identified billing errors that had cost the company hundreds of dollars, and impressed the senior partners enough to earn a salary of $300 per year. Within 2 years, he was managing significant transactions, corresponding directly with suppliers and buyers, and demonstrating an uncanny ability to spot favorable deals in commodity markets. But something gnawed at him. Working for Hewitt and Tuttle meant earning a fixed salary, while the partners collected profits from deals he arranged. The mathematics bothered him. He brought value but captured only a fraction of it. His employer owned his productivity. In 1858, at 19 years old, John approached a business acquaintance named Maurice Clark with a proposition. They should form a commission business partnership, pooling their capital and knowledge. Clark had experience and industry connections. John had $800 in savings, scraped together from his salary and those turkey-selling profits from childhood, and an almost obsessive understanding of cost structures. Clark agreed. They borrowed an additional $1,000 from John's father at 10% interest, William Avery Rockefeller, practicing his capitalism lessons again, and opened Clark and Rockefeller, commission merchants in Cleveland. The partnership began operating just as regional tensions spiraled toward civil war. The Civil War transformed their business from modest to substantial. Armies needed food. The Union government purchased enormous quantities of grain, pork, salt, and other provisions. Prices fluctuated wildly based on military developments and shipping disruptions. The chaos created opportunities for traders with strong nerves and good information. John proved exceptional at both requirements. He cultivated relationships with grain producers in Ohio and Indiana, guaranteeing purchases when others hesitated. He developed reliable intelligence about military contracts and railroad capacity. While competitors panicked during price drops or overextended during spikes, John calculated, waited, and moved only when mathematics supported action. By 1863, Clark and Rockefeller was generating substantial profits. John was 24 years old and had accumulated enough capital to be considered wealthy by Cleveland standards. He dressed plainly, lived modestly, and donated 10% of his income to the Baptist church, as his mother had taught him. But satisfaction eluded him. Commission trading meant middleman work, connecting producers to consumers and taking a percentage. Real wealth, he recognized, came from controlling production itself. Something new was emerging in Pennsylvania and across Ohio. Entrepreneurs were drilling into the ground and pulling out a substance that some people were refining into kerosene for lamps. The industry was young, chaotic, and inefficient. Men were making and losing fortunes in months. It was a gambler's paradise, which meant it was also ripe for someone who didn't gamble, who calculated, who organized chaos into profitable structure. John Rockefeller started paying very close attention to the oil business. What he saw simultaneously appalled and excited him. Appalled, because the waste and disorganization violated everything he believed about proper commerce. Excited, because that very chaos meant enormous opportunity for someone willing to impose rational order. The quiet young bookkeeper from Cleveland was about to enter an industry that would make him the richest man in America and transform him into one of the most controversial figures in the nation's history. The lessons from his father and mother, the turkey-selling boyhood, the 42 days of job hunting, the commission trading, everything had been preparation. The real story was about to begin. First fortune, August 27, 1859. A man named Edwin Drake struck oil near Titusville, Pennsylvania, using a steam engine to drill 69 feet into the ground. The well produced 25 barrels per day. The event triggered a phenomenon that resembled the California gold rush a decade earlier, except instead of panning for gold, speculators drilled holes hoping for black crude. Within months, thousands of men flooded into western Pennsylvania. They leased land, drilled wells, and either struck oil or went broke. The successful ones faced a different problem: what to do with the crude. In its raw state, oil had limited use. It needed refining into useful products, particularly kerosene, which could illuminate homes more effectively than expensive whale oil. Refineries sprang up almost as quickly as wells. Anyone with basic chemical knowledge and modest capital could build a still and start processing crude. By 1863, Cleveland alone had 30 refineries. The business attracted risk-takers, chemists, and fortune seekers operating on thin margins, hoping to get rich before competition or fire. A constant danger in volatile refining operations destroyed them. John Rockefeller watched this chaos unfold and saw something different than most observers. Where others saw opportunity in drilling wells and striking oil, John saw the real value in refining and distribution. Oil in the ground was worthless until extracted. Extracted crude was nearly worthless until refined. Refined kerosene had value only if it reached consumers. The money, he calculated, wasn't in pulling oil from the earth. It was in the unglamorous middle stages that most speculators ignored in their rush toward drilling excitement. Samuel Andrews lived in Cleveland and operated a small refinery. He had emigrated from England, understood distillation chemistry, and produced a higher quality kerosene than most competitors. But Andrews lacked business acumen and capital to expand. In 1863, Maurice Clark suggested to John that they invest in Andrews's operation, diversifying their commission business into refining. John resisted initially. He studied the numbers, visited Andrews's facility, and examined the chaotic oil market carefully. Refining margins looked thin, crude prices fluctuated wildly. Most refiners operated on the edge of bankruptcy. But John noticed something others missed. The inefficiency represented opportunity, not danger, if you approached it correctly. The key was scale and cost control. Small refiners couldn't negotiate favorable rates with railroads. They lacked capital to maintain large crude inventories, forcing them to buy at high prices when supply tightened. They couldn't afford the most efficient distilling equipment. Each disadvantage was minor, but combined they meant small refiners would always struggle while a large, well-capitalized operation could thrive. In early 1863, John agreed to invest in Andrews's refinery, but only if they did it properly. They formed Andrews, Clark and Company, with John and Maurice Clark providing capital and Samuel Andrews contributing his technical expertise. They built a new facility in Cleveland's industrial district with larger capacity than most competitors. John insisted on meticulous cost accounting from day one, tracking every expense, measuring efficiency of every process, calculating margins on every barrel. The refinery started operating profitably almost immediately. While competitors gambled on crude prices or tried to maximize production volume, John focused on cost reduction. He negotiated volume discounts with railroads for shipping kerosene. He found buyers for byproducts other refiners discarded as waste. When acids used in refining grew expensive, he built his own acid plant. When barrels for shipping kerosene cost too much, he bought timber and built his own barrel factory. Each move individually saved small amounts per barrel. Collectively, they created a cost structure no competitor could match. By late 1864, Andrews, Clark and Company was producing more refined kerosene than any other Cleveland refinery, and doing so at significantly lower cost. But partnership tensions were emerging. Maurice Clark's relatives had joined the business, and the Clark family members wanted to expand aggressively, borrowing heavily to build additional refineries. John opposed reckless expansion. He believed in growth, but only when supported by capital reserves and clear profitability projections. The Clarks thought he was overly cautious, too conservative for an industry where fortunes came from bold moves. The disagreement came to a head in 1865. The partners argued constantly about investment strategy. The Clarks wanted to borrow. John refused. Finally, they agreed to dissolve the partnership through an auction where partners would bid against each other for the business. Whoever bid highest would buy out the others and gain complete control. February 2nd, 1865. The auction took place in a Cleveland office. The bidding started at $500 and climbed steadily. $1,000, $2,000, $5,000. The clerks were determined to win. So was John. $10,000, $15,000. The atmosphere grew tense. John's face showed no emotion, but inside he felt certainty. This refinery represented his future. He would not lose it. $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. The clerks hesitated. They were approaching the limit of what they could borrow. John bid $55,000. Silence filled the room. Maurice Clark looked at his relatives. They shook their heads. They couldn't match it. "The business is yours, John," Maurice Clark said. At 25 years old, John D. Rockefeller owned one of Cleveland's largest refineries. He immediately renamed it Rockefeller and Andrews. He also immediately formalized the operational principles that would define his approach: meticulous cost accounting, vertical integration to reduce reliance on suppliers, reinvestment of profits into efficiency improvements rather than dividends, and systematic information gathering about markets and competitors. The business grew rapidly. By 1866, Rockefeller and Andrews was producing Cleveland's highest quality kerosene at the industry's lowest cost. John opened a New York office to handle Eastern sales, placing his brother William in charge. He built additional capacity in Cleveland. Revenue climbed from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. John also married. In 1864, he wed Laura Celestia Spellman, called Setty, the daughter of an Ohio merchant and abolitionist. She shared his Baptist faith, his distrust of ostentation, and his belief in systematic philanthropy. Their marriage followed the same disciplined pattern as his business affairs: stable, planned, focused on long-term goals rather than immediate gratification. But even as his refinery thrived, John recognized a larger problem. The oil industry remained chaotic. Hundreds of refiners competed, driving down prices. Overproduction of crude led to wild price swings. Railroads played refiners against each other, raising shipping rates whenever possible. Everyone competed, no one cooperated, and the instability threatened to drag down even efficient operations like his. In 1866, John began contemplating a radical idea. What if, instead of competing with other refiners, he bought them, not just one or two, but systematically, until his company controlled enough refining capacity to stabilize the industry? Consolidation would eliminate wasteful competition, allow better negotiation with railroads, and bring rational order to the chaos. The idea violated conventional business wisdom. Most entrepreneurs protected their independence fiercely. Selling your company meant admitting defeat. But John saw it differently. If he could convince competitors that joining his operation served their interests, offering them stock in a larger, more stable company, rather than forcing them to battle his superior cost structure, he could build something unprecedented. He started cautiously, approaching smaller refiners who were struggling. He offered fair prices, often keeping the previous owners as employees or junior partners. Word spread that Rockefeller paid honestly and honored agreements. More refiners began approaching him, willing to discuss terms. By 1867, Rockefeller and Andrews was absorbing competitors steadily. John's reputation was evolving. Some admired his efficiency and fair dealing. Others worried about the growing concentration of refining capacity under his control. A few recognized that something significant was emerging, though they couldn't quite articulate what. John knew exactly what was emerging. He was building the foundation of a consolidation that would eventually control not just Cleveland refining, not just Ohio refining, but the entire American oil industry. The young bookkeeper who once searched 42 days for work was engineering a transformation in how business itself operated. The stage was set, the strategy was forming, the empire was beginning. Within 5 years, the name Standard Oil would become synonymous with both industrial achievement and corporate power that frightened a nation. But first, John needed to formalize his vision and recruit partners who shared his ambition for systematic dominance. The quiet man from Cleveland was learning that true power came not from producing oil, but from controlling its flow from wellhead to consumer. Once you controlled that flow, you controlled everything. And John D. Rockefeller intended to control everything. Black Gold, January 10, 1870, Cleveland, Ohio. 29-year-old John D. Rockefeller sat in an office and incorporated a company that would reshape American capitalism. He called it Standard Oil Company. Initial capitalization, $1 million. It represented the largest refinery operation in Cleveland, already controlling approximately 10% of the nation's total refining capacity. The name carried intentional meaning. Standard implied consistency, reliability and quality assurance in an industry notorious for variable products and fraud. Many refiners cut kerosene with cheaper substances, creating lamps that smoked excessively or even exploded. Rockefeller positioned his brand as the standard against which others should be measured. The audacity of claiming to set the standard for an entire industry before actually dominating it revealed something essential about his thinking. He didn't just want market share. He wanted to define what the market itself meant. The partnership structure reflected careful planning. John D. Rockefeller held the largest stake, but deliberately recruited partners who brought specific capabilities. His brother William handled New York operations and sales. Samuel Andrews contributed technical refining expertise. Henry Flagler, who had married into a family with money and possessed sharp business instincts, became John's closest strategic partner. Flagler understood that the oil industry's real bottleneck wasn't refining capacity or crude supply, it was transportation. Railroads controlled access to markets. Crude oil traveled by rail from Pennsylvania fields to Cleveland refineries. Refined kerosene traveled by rail from Cleveland to eastern cities and export terminals. The railroad companies, the New York Central, the Erie, and the Pennsylvania Railroad, competed for oil shipping business, but also colluded to maintain high rates. For refiners, transportation costs often consumed a third of their margins. Whoever solved the transportation problem would dominate the industry. Flagler saw the solution clearly: leverage Standard Oil's growing volume to negotiate lower rates. By early 1870, Standard Oil was shipping 60 carloads per day, more than any competitor. Flagler approached railroad executives with a straightforward proposition. Standard Oil would guarantee high, consistent volume year-round. In exchange, railroads would offer reduced rates. The arrangement benefited both sides. Railroads got predictable traffic and avoided costly empty return trips. Standard Oil reduced its largest expense and gained cost advantages over every competitor. The railroads agreed. Standard Oil secured shipping rates significantly below published tariffs. Competitors who shipped smaller volumes paid more per barrel. The math was brutal. If your transportation cost was 50 cents per barrel and Rockefeller's was 30 cents, he could match your selling price while earning an additional 20 cents profit per barrel, or undercut your price while maintaining margins. Either way, you lost. But Flagler and Rockefeller devised something more aggressive than simple volume discounts. They negotiated drawbacks, rebates paid to Standard Oil based on competitors' shipments. For every barrel a competing refiner shipped, the railroad paid Standard Oil a small amount, sometimes as much as 25 cents per barrel. Standard Oil received money for its own shipments and for its competitors' shipments. The arrangement was legal but ethically questionable. It created a mechanism where Standard Oil profited from competing refineries' success while simultaneously making those competitors less viable. Cleveland refiners shipping oil at full rates were unknowingly funding their largest competitor's cost advantage. Few people outside railroad boardrooms and Standard Oil's inner circle knew the details. Rockefeller preferred it that way. By late 1870, Standard Oil was refining over 1,500 barrels daily and exerting pressure on Cleveland's other 29 refineries. Some struggled to match Rockefeller's prices, others maintained margins by accepting lower volumes. John methodically approached competitors with acquisition offers, presenting detailed calculations showing that their independent operations faced declining prospects while selling to Standard Oil offered fair valuations and potentially continued employment. Many accepted, some resisted. Those who resisted found circumstances growing more difficult. Standard Oil's cost advantages allowed it to undercut prices in markets where competitors were strongest. Its superior kerosene quality, backed by rigorous testing and consistency, attracted major buyers. Its connections with railroads gave it preferential shipping during periods of high demand, when other refiners faced delays. John never engaged in melodramatic confrontations. He didn't issue threats or use overtly intimidating tactics. Instead, he presented facts. Your costs are higher than ours. Your shipping rates exceed ours. Your profit margins are shrinking while ours expand. You can sell now at a fair price or continue struggling until your business is worth less. Most chose to sell. Alexander Schofield, William Rockefeller, and Andrews, all early partners, watched John orchestrate this consolidation with a combination of admiration and unease. His systematic approach to acquiring competitors revealed patience and ruthlessness that unsettled even allies. He genuinely believed he was improving the industry, eliminating waste, and bringing rational order to chaos. He also never hesitated to apply competitive pressure that drove rivals toward surrender. By 1872, Standard Oil controlled perhaps 25% of American refining capacity. That achievement positioned it as the industry's largest player, but not yet a true monopoly. John understood that partial dominance created instability. Competitors could still band together, form alliances, or innovate in ways that threatened Standard Oil's advantages. Total control required a more dramatic move. The opportunity came through something called the South Improvement Company, a scheme that would briefly give Standard Oil unprecedented power and permanently damage Rockefeller's public reputation. The plan emerged from railroad executives and a group of refiners who wanted to stabilize the industry by creating a cartel that controlled production and allocated shipments. The South Improvement Company would unite the major railroads and the largest refiners in a secret arrangement. Participating refiners would receive massive rebates, sometimes 50% off posted rates, plus drawbacks on competitors' shipments. In exchange, refiners would control production levels and respect assigned market territories. The agreement would effectively eliminate price competition and allow coordinated control of the oil industry. John recognized both the power and the risk. The arrangement would give Standard Oil crushing advantages over non-members, potentially allowing rapid consolidation. But the secrecy and brazenness of the scheme invited backlash if discovered. He debated the decision carefully, weighing potential gains against dangers. Ultimately, he joined. Standard Oil became part of the South Improvement Company in January 1872. The terms were extraordinary. Standard Oil would pay approximately $1.06 per barrel to ship crude from the oil regions to Cleveland, while non-member refiners paid $2.56. Standard Oil would also receive rebates totaling 40 cents per barrel on competitors' shipments. The mathematics provided overwhelming advantages. Word leaked in February 1872. Oil producers in Pennsylvania discovered the arrangement and reacted with fury. They viewed the South Improvement Company as a conspiracy by refiners and railroads to control prices and squeeze producers' profits. Mass meetings erupted across the oil regions. Producers formed an association and pledged to sell crude only to refiners who refused to join the South Improvement scheme. The backlash was intense. Newspaper editorials condemned the South Improvement Company as a monopolistic conspiracy. Pennsylvania's legislature launched investigations. Producers organized boycotts. The railroads, facing public outrage and potential regulation, backed away from the agreement. By April 1872, the South Improvement Company was dead, its charter revoked. But Rockefeller had already used the brief period when the arrangement was active to maximum advantage. During February and March 1872, armed with the promised rebates, he had approached every significant refiner in Cleveland with acquisition offers backed by the implicit threat that the South Improvement advantages made competition futile. Faced with the prospect of impossible cost disparities, most Cleveland refiners sold. Later, critics would call this period the Cleveland Massacre, claiming Rockefeller used the South Improvement scheme to coerce competitors into selling at unfair prices. John always maintained that he paid fair valuations and that sellers made rational business decisions. The truth likely sat between those positions. He offered reasonable terms, but under circumstances where refusal seemed economically suicidal. By April 1872, Standard Oil owned or controlled 22 of Cleveland's 26 refineries. It dominated the city's refining sector completely. The South Improvement Company had failed publicly but succeeded privately in giving Rockefeller the window he needed to consolidate Cleveland. With that base secured, he turned attention to refineries in other cities: Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York. The pattern repeated. Standard Oil approached refiners, offered stock in the company or cash buyouts, and emphasized the advantages of joining the strongest operation versus competing against it. Most accepted. Those who refused faced relentless price competition in their core markets. Standard Oil could afford to sell kerosene at a loss in specific regions temporarily, using profits from areas where it faced less competition to subsidize strategic battles. Small refiners lacked that luxury. The consolidation accelerated. By 1873, Standard Oil was refining approximately 10,000 barrels daily and controlled over 40% of American refining capacity. John kept expanding, building new refineries, buying terminals, acquiring pipelines, integrating operations vertically to reduce costs further. He also maintained strict secrecy about the company's structure. When Standard Oil acquired competitors, it often allowed them to continue operating under their original names, creating the appearance of competition where none existed. Consumers and even many industry participants didn't realize how much control Standard Oil had accumulated. Samuel Dodd, a lawyer Standard Oil would later employ, observed that Rockefeller approached business like chess, thinking multiple moves ahead and positioning pieces so opponents had no good options. The comparison was apparent. John studied industries systematically, identified choke points where control provided leverage, and moved methodically to dominate those positions. By 1874, Standard Oil refined over 60% of American oil. It controlled the industry's largest pipeline network. It operated terminals in major ports. It had relationships with railroads that ensured favorable rates. John D. Rockefeller was 35 years old and had created the most powerful commercial enterprise in American history. But that success carried consequences. Competitors who survived grew increasingly hostile. Oil producers resented refiner power over prices. Journalists began investigating Standard Oil's methods. Politicians started questioning whether such concentrated economic power was compatible with democratic principles. John believed deeply that Standard Oil benefited consumers and improved the oil industry's efficiency. He had reduced kerosene prices significantly, making lighting affordable for ordinary families. He had eliminated wasteful competition and brought operational discipline to a chaotic sector. In his view, the consolidation was rational, beneficial, and entirely justified. Others disagreed. They saw a monopoly using unfair advantages to crush competition and accumulate wealth through manipulation rather than innovation. The tension between these perspectives would define the next 4 decades of Standard Oil's existence and shape debates about capitalism that continue into the present. The company that started with $1 million in capital was becoming an empire. The quiet Baptist from Cleveland was becoming the most powerful businessman in America. The question now was whether that power could be sustained, and more fundamentally, whether a democratic society would allow one company to control an essential industry so completely. The battle was just beginning. Standard Oil had won the first phase, dominating refining. The next phase would require controlling production, transportation, and distribution even more thoroughly. And it would require confronting opponents who were learning to fight back. Secret deals. The public knew Standard Oil as a large refining company based in Cleveland. That understanding was approximately 50% accurate and 100% inadequate. By the mid-1870s, Standard Oil had become something more complex and more powerful than a conventional corporation. John D. Rockefeller had engineered a structure that allowed coordination across seemingly independent companies while keeping the full scope of control invisible to competitors, regulators, and the public. The mechanism was brilliant in its simplicity. When Standard Oil acquired a competing refinery, it frequently allowed the previous owner to remain as manager or even to keep the company name. To outside observers, firms like Acme Oil in New York or Imperial Oil in Canada appeared independent. In reality, Standard Oil controlled them through majority stock ownership or complete but undisclosed buyouts. A network of seemingly competing refineries was actually a single entity moving in coordinated fashion. This structure provided multiple advantages. It maintained the appearance of market competition, reducing political pressure for regulation. It allowed Standard Oil to gather intelligence about regional markets through local operations that competitors trusted more than the Cleveland giant. It enabled price discrimination, charging different rates in different markets based on local competition without making the strategy obvious, and it confused opponents who tried to track Standard Oil's true size and power. Henry Flagler managed much of this expansion. He traveled constantly, meeting with refinery owners, negotiating terms, and structuring deals. His approach matched Rockefeller's, methodical, factual, and focused on demonstrating that resistance was futile while cooperation was profitable. Flagler would arrive in a city, compile detailed information about every refinery's capacity and financial situation, then approach owners with offers backed by comprehensive market analysis. The pitch followed a pattern. Standard Oil offers fair valuation, immediate payment, and often continued employment. Your refinery joins the most efficient operation in the industry with the lowest costs and best market access. Refusing means competing against an entity that can undercut your prices indefinitely. The mathematics favor selling. Most owners recognized the logic and accepted. Flagler also pioneered another strategy that extended Standard Oil's power, acquiring critical infrastructure beyond refineries. He bought pipelines that transported crude from production areas to refineries. He purchased terminals where kerosene was stored before distribution. He secured tank cars for railroad shipping when Standard Oil's volume exceeded available equipment. Each acquisition gave Standard Oil control over another piece of the value chain and made competitors more dependent on infrastructure that Standard Oil operated. By 1876, Standard Oil controlled approximately 70% of American refining capacity, though few people outside the oil industry realized it. The company was processing 25,000 barrels daily, had operations in multiple states, and was beginning international expansion. Kerosene exports to Europe were growing rapidly, bringing American illumination to foreign markets and generating substantial profits. This expansion required capital beyond what internal profits provided. Standard Oil needed additional investment but wanted to maintain control. The solution was increasing capitalization while keeping ownership concentrated. In 1872, capital stock had been $2.5 million. By 1877, it reached $3.5 million. In each recapitalization, existing shareholders maintained their proportional stakes, keeping power firmly in Rockefeller's hands while bringing in resources to fund continued expansion. John also refined his negotiating tactics. When approaching a competitor, he arrived armed with information that often shocked the target. He knew the competitor's costs, debts, recent sales figures, and financial vulnerabilities. This intelligence came from multiple sources: Standard Oil employees who tracked shipments and prices, railroad contacts who shared competitor shipping data, even financial institutions that discussed clients' credit situations. Armed with this information, John could demonstrate that selling represented the only rational choice. He knew your break-even point, your debt service requirements, and which customers you were about to lose. Negotiating against someone with perfect information about your situation, while you had limited insight into theirs, created overwhelming disadvantage. Many competitors later claimed they felt trapped into selling, though Rockefeller never overtly threatened them. William Vanderbilt, who controlled the New York Central Railroad, developed a close relationship with Standard Oil during this period. The railroad depended heavily on oil shipping revenue, and Standard Oil provided the highest, most consistent volumes. Vanderbilt ensured that Standard Oil received preferential treatment, the best tank cars, priority scheduling during busy periods, and rate advantages over smaller shippers. This relationship illustrated a broader pattern. Railroads theoretically competed with each other, but they all recognized that Standard Oil's business was too valuable to risk losing. Standard Oil played them against each other expertly, threatening to shift volume from one railroad to another if rates weren't competitive. The railroads, unable to coordinate their response effectively, each sought to protect their relationship with Standard Oil, even if it meant disadvantaging smaller refiners. The Pennsylvania Railroad depended especially heavily on oil traffic. When independent refiners in Pittsburgh complained about rate discrimination favoring Standard Oil, the railroad faced a dilemma. Officially supporting the independents might cause Standard Oil to shift shipments to competing rail lines. Ignoring the independents' complaints risked political backlash and potential regulation. The railroad attempted to balance these pressures, offering modest concessions to independents while maintaining Standard Oil's core advantages. John exploited these tensions ruthlessly. He understood that railroads needed his business more than he needed any specific railroad. If pushed, Standard Oil could shift traffic, build its own pipelines, or even construct alternative transportation infrastructure. Small refiners lacked those options. This asymmetric dependence gave Rockefeller extraordinary leverage, and he used it systematically. In 1877, he negotiated an agreement with the major railroads that formalized rebates in exchange for guaranteed shipment volumes. The contract promised Standard Oil would ship at least 65 carloads daily on specific routes. In return, Standard Oil received rates averaging 20 to 30% below published tariffs. The agreement also included drawbacks on competitors' shipments, though these were smaller than the South Improvement Company had attempted. Independent refiners who learned of the arrangement were outraged. They appealed to railroad commissioners, wrote newspaper editorials, and lobbied legislators. The rebate system struck them as fundamentally unfair, a mechanism where economic power translated directly into cost advantages that made competition impossible. Rockefeller defended the arrangements consistently. Large shippers, he argued, deserved better rates because they provided railroads with efficient, predictable traffic. Standard Oil's volume allowed railroads to achieve economies of scale. The benefits weren't favors, they were rational economic responses to Standard Oil's superior efficiency and reliability. Any refiner who could match Standard Oil's volume would receive comparable rates. This defense was technically accurate, but practically meaningless. No single competitor could match Standard Oil's volume precisely because Standard Oil had consolidated so much capacity. The rebate system rewarded size, which prevented competitors from achieving the size necessary to compete. It was a brilliant self-reinforcing mechanism that ensured Standard Oil's dominance would perpetuate indefinitely. Pipelines emerged as the next battleground. Originally, crude oil moved from wells to railheads via teams of horses pulling wagons, a slow and expensive process. In the early 1870s, entrepreneurs began constructing pipelines that pumped crude directly from production areas to refineries or railroad terminals. Pipelines dramatically reduced transportation costs and gave owners significant control over crude flow. Standard Oil initially didn't own major pipeline networks. Independent pipeline companies operated across Pennsylvania and nearby regions. But John recognized that pipelines represented potential vulnerability. If pipeline operators hostile to Standard Oil gained control over crude transportation, they could threaten the company's access to raw materials or favor competing refiners. The solution was straightforward: buy the pipelines. Between 1874 and 1877, Standard Oil acquired several significant pipeline companies, including the American Transfer Company and the United Pipelines. These acquisitions were often structured through intermediaries to obscure Standard Oil's involvement. A group of investors would purchase a pipeline, then quietly transfer control to Standard Oil, allowing continued operation under the original name. By 1878, Standard Oil controlled approximately 80% of pipelines connecting Pennsylvania oil fields to major railroads and refineries. Independent producers now relied on Standard Oil infrastructure to move crude to market. This gave Standard Oil leverage over crude prices. If producers demanded prices Standard Oil considered too high, the company could reduce pipeline throughput, leaving crude stranded in the production fields. Producers organized to fight back. They formed the Petroleum Producers Union in 1878, pledging to withhold crude from Standard Oil and demanding that railroads stop discriminating against independent refiners. The strike lasted several months, creating temporary shortages and raising crude prices. Some independent refiners expanded operations, hoping the disruption would weaken Standard Oil. John waited patiently. Standard Oil had crude inventories sufficient to maintain operations for months. It also had relationships with producers who quietly broke the boycott, selling to Standard Oil despite union pledges. As the strike extended, producers faced financial pressure. Crude sitting in storage generated no revenue. Many producers had borrowed against expected sales. When banks started pressing for payments, the strike crumbled. By late 1878, the Petroleum Producers Union had collapsed. Producers resumed selling to Standard Oil, accepting whatever prices the company offered. The failed strike demonstrated a harsh lesson. Withholding supply hurt producers more than it hurt a well-capitalized buyer with inventory buffers and alternative suppliers. Standard Oil emerged from the confrontation even stronger. It had weathered the supply disruption, maintained operations, and proven that collective action by producers couldn't overcome its structural advantages. The message to the industry was clear: Standard Oil was unassailable through conventional competitive tactics. Flagler summarized the situation in a letter to a business associate. "We control the refining, we control the pipelines, we influence the railroads. No independent refiner can operate profitably in this environment. Consolidation will continue until we refine 90% of American oil, and that day approaches faster than most people realize." The prediction was accurate. By 1880, Standard Oil was refining approximately 90% of all American oil. It operated in multiple states through dozens of affiliated companies. Its pipeline network spanned Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. It had market dominance in the East, growing presence in the West, and expanding international sales. Annual revenues exceeded $50 million, generating profits that made John D. Rockefeller one of the richest men in America. But success created growing problems. The company's structure was becoming untenable. Standard Oil of Ohio, the parent company, legally couldn't own property in other states under Ohio corporate law. The various affiliated companies operated in legal gray areas, connected through informal agreements and trust arrangements that regulatory authorities were starting to scrutinize. Moreover, Standard Oil's power was attracting political attention. Journalists were investigating the company's practices. State legislatures were considering regulations targeting monopolies. Independent refiners were lobbying for government intervention. The very success that made Standard Oil dominant was generating forces that threatened its existence. John needed a solution that would formalize the corporate structure, make Standard Oil's operations legal and transparent, yet maintain centralized control and operational secrecy. The answer would be controversial, innovative, and would create a corporate form that other industries would imitate for decades. Standard Oil was about to reorganize itself using a mechanism that would add a new term to the American vocabulary and permanently associate the Rockefeller name with monopolistic power, the trust. Total control, January 2nd, 1882. 9 men gathered in a nondescript office in New York City and signed an agreement that would reshape American corporate organization. They created the Standard Oil Trust, a structure that consolidated 40 separate companies into a unified entity while providing legal protection and operational flexibility that conventional incorporation couldn't match. The architect was Samuel Dodd, Standard Oil's chief legal counsel. Ohio law prohibited corporations chartered in Ohio from owning property or conducting business in other states. This meant Standard Oil of Ohio couldn't legally own the refineries, pipelines, and terminals it controlled across the country. The company operated through a patchwork of separate corporations technically owned by Rockefeller and his associates personally, coordinated through informal agreements. Dodd recognized this structure was vulnerable. Competitors could challenge the arrangements in court. State regulators could investigate whether Standard Oil was violating Ohio's corporate charter. The complexity made operations difficult and left the empire dependent on handshake agreements rather than formal legal structures. The solution was the trust. All stockholders in the various Standard Oil companies would transfer their shares to a board of 9 trustees. In exchange, shareholders would receive trust certificates representing their proportional ownership. The trustees would hold legal title to all Standard Oil properties and would direct operations across every company, state, and business line. The arrangement consolidated control while respecting state corporate laws because each individual company remained legally separate, now owned not by an out-of-state corporation but by trustees. The Standard Oil Trust began with $70 million in capital, making it the largest commercial enterprise in the world. John D. Rockefeller held approximately 27% of trust certificates, giving him personal wealth that exceeded any American before him. The other trustees, Flagler, William Rockefeller, John Archbold, and 5 others, held substantial stakes but followed John's leadership without question. The trust structure was technically legal, brilliantly designed, and ethically questionable. It created unified control without creating a single vulnerable corporation that state authorities could easily regulate or dismantle. It allowed Standard Oil to operate as a monopoly while maintaining the legal fiction of separate companies. And it provided a template that other industries would quickly imitate, leading to massive industrial consolidation across the American economy. With the structure formalized, Standard Oil moved to tighten control over every aspect of the oil business. The company already dominated refining and pipelines. Now it expanded into distribution, marketing, and direct consumer sales. The goal was comprehensive vertical integration, controlling oil from the moment it left the ground until it burned in a customer's lamp. Standard Oil created regional distribution networks throughout the United States. The company built warehouses in towns and cities where kerosene was stored and sold to local merchants. It manufactured its own tanks, pipes, and dispensing equipment. It employed sales agents who visited stores personally, offering favorable credit terms and volume discounts that independent kerosene wholesalers couldn't match. In many communities, local kerosene dealers faced a choice: buy from Standard Oil at prices that allowed thin margins, or face direct competition from Standard Oil agents who would sell to consumers at rates that undercut the local dealers' wholesale costs. Most dealers accepted Standard Oil's terms. Those who resisted found themselves competing against an entity with essentially unlimited resources. The distribution expansion gave Standard Oil tremendous market intelligence. Sales agents reported which competitors were operating in their territories, what prices they charged, and which customers they served. This information flowed back to Cleveland and New York, where managers compiled detailed maps of market conditions nationwide. When a competitor appeared in a territory, Standard Oil could respond with targeted price cuts designed to eliminate the threat. This strategy of predatory pricing remains controversial. Standard Oil defenders argue the company simply offered better prices that reflected superior efficiency. Critics contend Standard Oil deliberately sold below cost in specific markets, using profits from monopoly regions to subsidize temporary losses until competitors were destroyed, then raised prices once the threat was eliminated. Evidence supports both perspectives depending on circumstances. In some cases, Standard Oil's lower prices reflected genuine cost advantages. In others, the company clearly sold below any possible cost structure, accepting losses to drive competitors out. Internal Standard Oil correspondence reveals discussions of going for specific competitors by cutting prices in their core markets while maintaining prices elsewhere. One documented example: in 1881, a small refiner in Buffalo began selling kerosene in upstate New York at prices below Standard Oil's. Within months, Standard Oil flooded the region with kerosene priced 20 to 30% below the competitors' rates. Sales agents offered special discounts to any retailer who bought exclusively from Standard Oil. The Buffalo refiner's sales collapsed. Within a year, the company was bankrupt. Standard Oil purchased its assets at auction and immediately raised kerosene prices in the region back to previous levels. Similar patterns played out across the country. Standard Oil tolerated no sustained competition. Where competitors emerged, the company responded with overwhelming force: price cuts, exclusive dealer agreements, acquisition offers that implied accepting was wise while declining was dangerous. The combination of economic pressure and strategic intelligence made resisting Standard Oil exceptionally difficult. Standard Oil also expanded internationally during this period. Kerosene demand was growing in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The company established export terminals in New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. It built relationships with foreign distributors. It even began constructing bulk ships designed specifically for transporting kerosene across oceans in quantity. Overseas expansion faced different challenges than domestic markets. Foreign governments regulated commerce differently. Cultural preferences varied. Competition came from Russian oil fields and emerging production in the Dutch East Indies. Standard Oil adapted systematically, studying each market, establishing local operations, and applying the same strategic principles that had worked in America: operational efficiency, comprehensive distribution networks, and competitive persistence. By 1885, Standard Oil was exporting approximately 70% of its kerosene production. American oil illuminated European cities, Asian villages, and South American homes. The company operated on 5 continents, employed tens of thousands of workers, and generated annual revenues exceeding $100 million. It had achieved a level of international commercial reach unprecedented in human history. John D. Rockefeller was now 46 years old and unimaginably wealthy. His personal fortune exceeded $300 million, equivalent to hundreds of billions in modern currency. He owned a substantial estate in New York, maintained offices in Cleveland and New York City, and was beginning to contemplate philanthropy on a scale matching his business success. But wealth brought complications. The more successful Standard Oil became, the more attention it attracted from critics. Labor unions accused the company of suppressing wages and opposing worker organization. Small business advocates condemned its monopolistic practices. Political reformers argued that such concentrated economic power was incompatible with democracy. Journalists began investigating Standard Oil's methods, publishing exposés that portrayed Rockefeller as a robber baron who had built wealth through manipulation and coercion. Henry Demarest Lloyd published an article in 1881 titled "The Story of a Great Monopoly" that described Standard Oil's tactics in damning detail. Lloyd documented the railroad rebates, the secret acquisitions, the predatory pricing, and the coordinated crushing of competitors. The article received wide attention and damaged Standard Oil's reputation significantly. John rarely responded publicly to criticism. He believed actions spoke louder than words, and that explaining business strategies to people unfamiliar with industry realities was futile. He also held genuine conviction that Standard Oil had improved the oil industry, reduced prices for consumers, and brought order to chaos. In his view, critics misunderstood efficiency and competitive vigor as something sinister, but silence allowed opponents to shape public perception. Without counter-narratives, the robber baron characterization took hold. Standard Oil became synonymous with monopolistic abuse, and Rockefeller became a symbol of unregulated capitalism's dangers. State legislatures began investigating Standard Oil. Ohio officials questioned whether the trust structure violated state law. Pennsylvania legislators examined railroad rebates. New York regulators investigated whether Standard Oil was engaged in restraint of trade. These inquiries produced extensive testimony documenting the company's practices, but resulted in limited immediate action. Standard Oil's lawyers defended the company skillfully, and political will for serious regulation remained weak. The company also faced internal challenges. As it grew larger, maintaining operational coordination across dozens of affiliated companies became complex. Different regions had different managers with different approaches. Some executives wanted aggressive expansion into new products like gasoline, which was then considered a nearly worthless byproduct of kerosene refining. Others preferred focusing on core kerosene operations. John handled these tensions through meticulous organizational discipline. He instituted detailed reporting requirements across all Standard Oil operations. Every refinery submitted weekly production reports, cost breakdowns, and market analyses. Regional managers provided regular updates on competition, prices, and strategic challenges. This information flowed to headquarters, where John and the senior trustees reviewed it systematically. The reporting system gave Standard Oil an informational advantage that complemented its operational and financial strengths. The company knew more about oil markets than anyone else in the industry, more than individual competitors, more than regulators, more than even many of its own employees realized. This knowledge enabled precise strategic decisions, while competitors operated with incomplete understanding of market conditions. Standard Oil also pioneered industrial research during this period. The company established laboratories where chemists worked to improve refining processes, develop new products, and find uses for byproducts that other refiners discarded. This research produced incremental but cumulatively significant improvements in efficiency and product quality. One innovation was developing cracking processes that increased the kerosene yield from crude oil. Traditional distillation methods left significant portions of crude oil as waste products. Standard Oil chemists discovered that applying heat and pressure could break down heavier molecules into lighter compounds, including kerosene. This breakthrough improved yields by 10 to 15%, directly increasing profits from each barrel of crude processed. Another focus was gasoline. In the 1880s, gasoline was largely useless, too volatile for lamps, with no significant market. Standard Oil often burned it as waste or sold it cheaply as a cleaning solvent. But some researchers recognized potential. If internal combustion engines developed as some inventors were attempting, gasoline could become valuable as fuel. Standard Oil began stockpiling gasoline and improving refining methods to produce it efficiently, positioning the company for a future market that didn't yet exist. By 1890, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of American oil refining, 88% of refined oil distribution, and significant portions of crude production and pipeline infrastructure. It had achieved the monopoly John had envisioned 20 years earlier when he started systematically acquiring Cleveland refineries. The empire was complete. Standard Oil had no meaningful domestic competition, international operations that reached most global markets, and financial resources that dwarfed any potential challenger. It represented both the triumph of rational business organization and a stark demonstration of what unregulated capitalism could produce. John D. Rockefeller, the boy who once sold turkeys for pennies and saved his coins in a blue bowl, had built the largest fortune in American history. He had taken a chaotic, wasteful industry and organized it into a machine of extraordinary efficiency. He had reduced kerosene prices dramatically, making lighting affordable for ordinary Americans. He had also destroyed hundreds of competitors, manipulated markets, and accumulated power that many people found frightening. The question now was whether that power could be sustained. Forces were gathering that would challenge Standard Oil's monopoly and ultimately force its dismantlement. But those battles lay ahead. For the moment, John D. Rockefeller stood at the apex of American capitalism, commanding an empire that touched every corner of the nation and reached around the world. The story wasn't finished. The greatest confrontation was still coming. But Standard Oil's dominance was complete, its methods perfected, and its architect securely positioned as the most powerful businessman in American history. Hidden empire. Most Americans who lit kerosene lamps in their homes during the 1880s had no idea they were customers of Standard Oil. They bought kerosene from local dealers under various brand names: Acme, Divo, Pratt's, Atlantic, Consolidated, Continental, and dozens of others. These appeared to be competing companies offering choices. In reality, Standard Oil owned or controlled nearly all of them. The deliberate obscuring of Standard Oil's reach served strategic purposes. Maintaining the appearance of competition reduced political pressure for regulation. It allowed differentiated pricing, premium brands in wealthier markets, economy brands in price-sensitive regions, all from the same source. It also enabled intelligence gathering, as competitors and suppliers treated independent Standard Oil subsidiaries as potential allies rather than extensions of the dominant monopoly. This hidden empire extended far beyond refining. Standard Oil manufactured the barrels that held kerosene. It owned forests that supplied lumber for barrels. It operated cooperages where barrels were assembled. When barrel costs seemed excessive, Standard Oil integrated backward into timber and barrel making, reducing dependence on suppliers and capturing additional margin. The same pattern applied to virtually every input Standard Oil required. Acids for refining. Standard Oil built acid plants. Glue for barrel construction. Standard Oil manufactured glue. Railroad tank cars for shipping. Standard Oil became the largest tank car owner in America, leasing them to railroads that then transported Standard Oil products in Standard Oil equipment. This comprehensive vertical integration created efficiency gains, but also erected barriers to competition that were nearly insurmountable. A potential competitor needed to match not just refining efficiency, but also Standard Oil's advantages in transportation, distribution, barrel manufacturing, chemical production, and dozens of other operational areas. The capital required to compete effectively climbed from tens of thousands of dollars in the 1860s to millions by the 1880s. William Rockefeller managed much of the Eastern operations from New York offices at 26 Broadway, a building that became synonymous with Standard Oil's power. From there, he coordinated export operations, managed relationships with financial institutions, and oversaw the complex web of affiliated companies that comprise Standard Oil's Atlantic seaboard presence. The New York operation revealed another dimension of Standard Oil's sophistication: financial engineering. The company didn't simply operate refineries and sell kerosene. It managed currency exchanges for international operations, hedged commodity price risks, and invested surplus capital in securities that generated additional returns. Standard Oil functioned partially as a bank, with financial resources and expertise that allowed it to weather market disruptions that devastated smaller competitors. During the oil price collapse of 1884 to 1885, when crude prices dropped from approximately $1.25 per barrel to 61 cents, and refining margins compressed severely, hundreds of small producers and refiners went bankrupt. Standard Oil not only survived but expanded, purchasing distressed assets at favorable prices and acquiring crude oil production capacity that had previously remained in independent hands. This crisis demonstrated a principle John D. Rockefeller understood intuitively: downturns weren't disasters but opportunities for companies with strong balance sheets. While competitors panicked and liquidated, Standard Oil waited patiently, maintained operations and bought assets when sellers became desperate. Each industry crisis left Standard Oil stronger in relative terms. John Archbold increasingly managed Standard Oil's operational details during this period. John D. Rockefeller remained the dominant figure and ultimate decision-maker, but he was beginning to delegate daily management to trusted lieutenants. Archbold, a former independent refiner who had sold to Standard Oil and become a loyal executive, combined technical knowledge with aggressive competitive instincts. Under Archbold's management, Standard Oil refined its intelligence-gathering operations. The company maintained extensive files on competitors, tracking their capacity, costs, financial condition, and strategic plans. Information came from multiple sources: railroad shipping data, supplier relationships, employees who switched from competitors to Standard Oil, even social connections that provided casual insights during industry gatherings. This intelligence network gave Standard Oil an almost uncanny ability to anticipate competitive moves. When a group of investors planned to build a new refinery in a particular location, Standard Oil often knew before construction began. The company could then decide whether to acquire the operation before it became functional, establish competing capacity nearby, or negotiate arrangements with suppliers and railroads that would disadvantage the new entrant. In one documented case, independent refiners in the oil regions of Pennsylvania attempted to build a pipeline that would bypass Standard Oil infrastructure, connecting producers directly to railroads and reducing Standard Oil's leverage over crude transportation. The project required crossing property owned by multiple landowners, constructing pumping stations, and securing financing for what represented a significant capital investment. Standard Oil learned of the plan early and responded systematically. Agents purchased property along the proposed pipeline route, creating ownership obstacles. Standard Oil representatives approached potential investors, describing risks that made financing difficult. The company also constructed its own pipeline along a parallel route, investing whatever capital was necessary to ensure the competitive pipeline couldn't establish a transportation advantage. The independent pipeline project eventually failed, with enormous losses for its backers. Standard Oil's competing pipeline succeeded, further strengthening the company's control over crude transportation. The episode illustrated both Standard Oil's competitive ruthlessness and its willingness to invest aggressively when strategic interests were threatened. Standard Oil's dominance also extended into politics, though the company avoided direct involvement that would attract attention. Instead, executives cultivated relationships with legislators, contributed to political campaigns, and employed lobbyists who worked quietly to prevent regulatory measures that might constrain Standard Oil's operations. In Ohio, Standard Oil maintained close relationships with legislators from Cleveland and surrounding districts, ensuring that proposals to revoke the company's charter or restrict its operations faced significant opposition. In Pennsylvania, Standard Oil worked with railroad representatives to prevent legislation that would prohibit shipping rebates. In New York, company attorneys argued before regulators that Standard Oil's operations benefited consumers through lower prices and therefore should not face restrictive oversight. These efforts succeeded partly because Standard Oil could legitimately claim that its operations reduced costs and prices. Kerosene that cost 30 cents per gallon in the early 1860s sold for 8 cents by the mid-1880s. This price decline reflected both increasing crude supplies and Standard Oil's operational efficiencies. Critics acknowledged the price reductions, but argued they came at the cost of concentrated economic power that was dangerous regardless of immediate consumer benefits. Public opinion was divided. Working-class consumers appreciated affordable kerosene. Small business owners resented Standard Oil's dominance and the elimination of independent entrepreneurs. Farmers, many of whom sold crude from wells on their property, disliked Standard Oil's control over crude prices. Political reformers viewed the company as evidence that industrial capitalism required government oversight to prevent monopolistic abuse. Journalists played an increasingly important role in shaping these debates. Ida Tarbell, whose father had been an independent oil producer crushed by Standard Oil's expansion, began researching the company's history in the late 1880s. Her investigations would eventually produce a 19-part series in McClure's magazine, published between 1902 and 1904, that documented Standard Oil's tactics in exhaustive detail and permanently damaged John D. Rockefeller's public reputation. But in the 1880s, Tarbell was just beginning her research, and Standard Oil's public relations consisted primarily of silence. John D. Rockefeller almost never gave interviews. He didn't publish explanations of Standard Oil's strategies. He didn't engage with critics publicly. His philosophy was that business success spoke for itself, and that attempting to court public favor was undignified and ineffective. This reticence created a vacuum that critics filled with their narratives. Without Standard Oil presenting its perspective, the robber baron characterization went largely unchallenged. Henry Demarest Lloyd's articles, widely reprinted and read, described Standard Oil as a ruthless monopoly that had built wealth through coercion and manipulation. In the absence of counterarguments, many readers accepted this portrayal. Standard Oil did attempt some discreet public relations. The company published pamphlets highlighting operational achievements and price reductions. It distributed information showing that kerosene prices in America were lower than in countries without Standard Oil's presence, arguing this proved the company's efficiency benefited consumers. These efforts were modest and reached limited audiences compared to the critical exposés that appeared in popular magazines. Internally, Standard Oil continued refining operations with almost obsessive attention to efficiency. The company measured everything: refining yields, labor productivity, transportation costs, packaging expenses, spoilage rates. Managers submitted detailed reports that were analyzed centrally and used to identify improvement opportunities. One small example illustrates the culture. Standard Oil discovered that workers soldering kerosene cans were using 40 drops of solder per can. Engineers studied the process and determined that 38 drops provided adequate sealing. The reduction saved a trivial amount per can, but applied across millions of cans annually, saved thousands of dollars. Standard Oil pursued hundreds of such marginal improvements, collectively creating cost advantages that competitors couldn't match. The company also pioneered employee benefits that were progressive for the era. Standard Oil provided pensions for long-serving employees, funded medical care for workers injured in industrial accidents, and offered profit-sharing programs that gave senior managers financial stakes in the company's success. These benefits reflected partly genuine paternalism and partly calculated strategy to reduce labor unrest and ensure loyalty. Labor organizing was growing across American industries during this period. Workers were forming unions, demanding better wages, safer conditions, and shorter hours. Standard Oil faced these pressures, but generally avoided the violent labor conflicts that plagued railroads, steel mills, and coal mines. The company's combination of competitive wages and benefit programs, along with willingness to dismiss and blacklist labor organizers, kept unionization limited. By 1890, Standard Oil's hidden empire encompassed more than just oil operations. The company had become a financial institution that invested surplus capital across multiple industries. It held railroad bonds, real estate, and equity stakes in various enterprises. John D. Rockefeller personally diversified his wealth beyond Standard Oil, though the company remained his primary focus and the source of most of his fortune. The transition from entrepreneur to financier was subtle but significant. In the 1860s and 1870s, John had personally managed refinery operations, negotiated individual contracts, and involved himself in operational details. By 1890, he focused primarily on strategy, capital allocation, and organizational structure. Trusted executives handled day-to-day operations while John concentrated on the broader empire. This evolution reflected both Standard Oil's maturation and John's recognition that the company had grown beyond what any individual could directly manage. The organization now employed thousands of people across dozens of facilities in multiple countries. It required systematic management structures, defined reporting relationships, and delegation of authority. John created those structures carefully, maintaining central control over strategic decisions while empowering regional managers to handle operational issues. The Standard Oil Trust was generating annual profits exceeding $30 million by 1890, an almost incomprehensible sum for the era. Dividends flowed to trust certificate holders, making many of them extraordinarily wealthy. John D. Rockefeller received dividends that exceeded $10 million annually, adding to a fortune that was approaching $500 million. That wealth created both power and vulnerability. John could influence industries, shape markets, and affect communities through capital allocation decisions. But concentrated wealth also attracted resentment, political attacks, and increasingly serious regulatory scrutiny. The very success of Standard Oil was generating forces that threatened its continued existence. State attorneys general were studying whether trust structures violated state laws against monopolies and restraint of trade. The federal government was considering whether the Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890, could be applied against Standard Oil. Journalists were investigating the company's practices with increasing sophistication and hostility. Competitors who survived were organizing politically to demand government intervention. Standard Oil's hidden empire was comprehensive and powerful, but it was built on foundations that were beginning to crack. The legal structures that enabled consolidated control were facing challenges. The public tolerance for monopolistic behavior was eroding. The political environment was shifting toward regulation and antitrust enforcement. John D. Rockefeller had built an empire more complete and powerful than any commercial enterprise in American history. The question now was whether that empire could survive in a democratic society increasingly uncomfortable with concentrated economic power. The battles that would determine Standard Oil's fate were approaching, and they would be fought not in markets but in courts, legislatures, and the arena of public opinion. Rising threats. The first serious legal challenge arrived from Ohio. In 1890, the state's attorney general filed suit demanding that Standard Oil's charter be revoked, on grounds that the company was operating a trust that violated Ohio law, prohibiting restraint of trade and monopolistic practices. The case, State of Ohio v. Standard Oil Company, forced Standard Oil to defend its structure and operations publicly for the first time. Company attorneys argued that Standard Oil had not violated its corporate charter, that the trust was a legitimate business organization, and that the company's success reflected efficiency rather than illegal conduct. They emphasized that kerosene prices had declined substantially under Standard Oil's dominance, benefiting consumers. Prosecutors countered with detailed evidence of Standard Oil's methods, the railroad rebates, the predatory pricing, the systematic acquisition of competitors through economic pressure, and the trust structure designed specifically to evade state corporate laws. They presented internal Standard Oil documents showing explicit discussions of crushing competitors and maintaining monopoly control. The trial attracted national attention. Newspapers covered proceedings extensively. Business leaders watched anxiously, recognizing that the outcome would affect corporate structures across industries. Trusts had proliferated following Standard Oil's model, and a ruling against Standard Oil threatened those arrangements. Reformers hoped for a decision that would break the monopoly and demonstrate that concentrated corporate power could be constrained through legal action. On March 2, 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil. The court found that the trust structure violated Ohio corporate law and constituted illegal restraint of trade. The decision ordered Standard Oil of Ohio to withdraw from the trust and cease coordinating operations with affiliated companies outside Ohio. The ruling represented a significant defeat, but Standard Oil had prepared for this possibility. The company's lawyers had already developed alternative structures that would maintain operational unity while technically complying with the court's order. Rather than dissolve the empire, Standard Oil reorganized. The trust officially dissolved in 1892. In its place, Standard Oil created a system of interlocking directorates and unified ownership structures. The same group of executives served on the boards of all major Standard Oil affiliated companies. Stock ownership remained consolidated among this leadership group. Operationally, companies continued coordinating exactly as before, but without the formal trust structure that courts had found illegal. The reorganization fooled no one. Independent refiners recognized that Standard Oil's monopoly remained intact despite the legal defeat. Prosecutors understood that the company had found a technical workaround that preserved actual control, but proving this required additional litigation, which was expensive and politically challenging. Meanwhile, threats emerged from unexpected directions. New oil discoveries in California, Texas, and Oklahoma were beginning to shift industry geography. Standard Oil controlled eastern production and refining, but these new fields initially fell outside its infrastructure network. Independent producers and refiners saw opportunities to establish operations before Standard Oil could extend its reach. California particularly concerned Standard Oil's leadership. The state's oil fields produced crude with different chemical properties than Pennsylvania oil, requiring modified refining processes. Geography created natural barriers. Transporting oil or refined products between California and eastern markets involved either long rail journeys or shipping around South America, both expensive and time-consuming. These factors gave California independence some insulation from Standard Oil's competitive advantages. Independent refiners formed the Union Oil Company of California in 1890, pooling capital and coordinating operations to resist Standard Oil's anticipated expansion. They built refineries, established distribution networks, and signed exclusive supply agreements with California producers. By the time Standard Oil seriously entered the California market in the mid-1890s, established competitors had secured significant positions. Standard Oil responded characteristically. It built large refineries with superior efficiency, established aggressive distribution operations, and cut prices to gain market share. But California independents fought back more effectively than Eastern competitors had managed. They matched price cuts, lobbied California legislators to prevent railroad rebate arrangements, and maintained operations even when margins compressed to near zero. The California battle demonstrated that Standard Oil, despite its enormous resources, couldn't simply replicate its Eastern monopoly when facing determined local resistance and geographical barriers. The company eventually captured significant California market share, but never achieved the 90% dominance it held nationally. Independent refiners like Union Oil survived and even thrived, proving that Standard Oil's power had limits. International competition also intensified. Russian oil production from fields near Baku was expanding rapidly, creating a significant rival to American oil in European and Asian markets. Russian crude, controlled largely by the Rothschild and Nobel families, was transported via railroads to Black Sea ports, then shipped to markets throughout Europe and Asia. Standard Oil initially dismissed Russian competition, confident that American production volumes and refining efficiency would maintain market leadership, but Russian producers improved operations systematically, and their geographical proximity to European markets provided transportation cost advantages. By the mid-1890s, Russian oil was capturing substantial European market share, forcing Standard Oil to reduce prices to remain competitive. The international price competition compressed Standard Oil's export margins significantly. In 1885, Standard Oil exported kerosene to Europe at prices that generated substantial profits. By 1895, prices had fallen by 40% due to Russian competition, and Standard Oil maintained volume only by accepting much lower returns. The company still profited due to superior efficiency, but the era of unchallenged international dominance had ended. Technological changes also threatened Standard Oil's position. Internal combustion engines were evolving from laboratory curiosities into practical devices. In Europe, inventors like Gottlieb Daimler and Carl Benz were developing automobile prototypes. These vehicles ran on gasoline, the substance Standard Oil had long considered a nearly worthless byproduct. If automobiles became commercially viable, gasoline demand could increase substantially, potentially transforming industry economics. Standard Oil was positioned advantageously. Its refineries produced gasoline as a matter of course, and the company had developed improved gasoline production processes. But automobiles also meant a different product mix, new distribution requirements, and potentially new competitors entering the oil business from automotive manufacturing or retail sectors. John D. Rockefeller, now in his mid-50s, was contemplating partial retirement. He had spent 3 decades building Standard Oil with intense focus. The company was secure, dominant, and spectacularly profitable. He had accumulated more wealth than he could conceivably spend. His health was declining, stress and overwork had caused digestive problems, insomnia, and other ailments. He wanted to focus more attention on philanthropy and less on daily business management. But stepping away was complicated. Standard Oil faced rising threats that required strategic responses. The legal environment was hostile and growing more so. Public opinion had turned sharply against the company. Competitors were emerging in regions where Standard Oil couldn't easily extend its advantages. International rivals were gaining strength. The business required continued vigilant management, not passive oversight. John began gradually reducing his operational involvement. He spent more time at his New York estate and less time in the 26 Broadway offices. He delegated more authority to John Archbold, who became de facto chief executive while John retained the title and ultimate decision-making power. Other trusted executives, Henry Flagler, William Rockefeller, Henry Rogers, assumed greater responsibilities. This transition created some organizational challenges. John's leadership style had been intensely personal and detail-oriented. Archbold was more aggressive and less inclined toward John's cautious approach. Tensions emerged over strategy. particularly regarding how Standard Oil should respond to growing political and legal attacks. Archbold favored actively fighting back, hiring private investigators to gather damaging information about critics, funding political campaigns for friendly legislators, and aggressively challenging legal actions. John preferred quieter approaches, believing that engaging with critics publicly would generate more negative attention than it resolved. The strategic debate reflected different generational perspectives. John had built Standard Oil during an era when business regulation was minimal and public opinion less relevant to corporate success. Archbold operated in an environment where progressive-era reforms were gaining political momentum, muckraking journalism was shaping public attitudes, and government intervention in business affairs was increasing. The tactics that had worked in the 1870s needed adjustment for the 1890s. Labor unrest added to Standard Oil's challenges. The broader American economy experienced significant strikes during the 1890s, the Homestead strike in steel, the Pullman strike in railroads, and numerous smaller labor actions across industries. Standard Oil had largely avoided major labor conflicts, but workers were organizing, and the company faced increasing pressure to raise wages and improve conditions. A strike at Standard Oil's Bayonne, New Jersey, refinery in 1895 illustrated the tensions. Workers demanded higher wages, shorter hours, and recognition of their union. Standard Oil refused, maintaining that the company already provided competitive compensation and that union recognition would compromise management authority. The strike lasted 3 months and involved violent clashes between strikers and replacement workers protected by company security and local police. Standard Oil eventually prevailed, outlasting striking workers and resuming operations with new hires. But the conflict generated negative publicity and revealed that even Standard Oil's paternalistic labor policies couldn't entirely prevent organizing efforts. The strike also demonstrated that maintaining operational control required not just market dominance, but also management of labor relations, public opinion, and political environments. By 1898, Standard Oil was still immensely powerful and profitable. It controlled approximately 85% of American oil refining, maintained the industry's most efficient operations, and generated annual profits exceeding $40 million. John D. Rockefeller's personal fortune had grown to approximately $600 million, making him by far the wealthiest American and among the richest individuals in world history. But the company's position was increasingly contested. Legal challenges were pending in multiple states. The federal government was considering antitrust action. Journalists were investigating Standard Oil with increasing sophistication and hostility. International competitors were gaining strength. New domestic oil fields were creating opportunities for independent producers and refiners. Public opinion had turned decisively against monopolies, viewing them as threats to economic opportunity and democratic governance. Standard Oil's empire remained intact, but it was under siege from multiple directions simultaneously. The question was no longer whether the company would face serious challenges, but whether it could survive them. The greatest battle in Standard Oil's history was approaching, and it would be fought in courts, newspapers, and the arena of public opinion, rather than in markets where the company's advantages had always been decisive. John D. Rockefeller had built an empire that dominated an industry and reshaped American capitalism. That empire was about to face a test that even his systematic planning and overwhelming resources might not be able to overcome. The progressive era was dawning, and with it came a fundamental reassessment of the relationship between concentrated corporate power and democratic society. Breaking point, November 18, 1906. A federal agent walked into Standard Oil's offices at 26 Broadway in New York and delivered a summons. The United States government was filing suit against Standard Oil Company and 70 affiliated companies, charging them with violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. The complaint alleged that Standard Oil constituted an illegal monopoly, engaged in restraint of trade, and demanded the company's dissolution. The action represented the culmination of 16 years of growing political pressure since the Sherman Act's passage. Previous administrations had enforced the antitrust law inconsistently, focusing mainly on labor unions rather than corporate combinations. But President Theodore Roosevelt had made trust-busting a centerpiece of his political identity, and Standard Oil was the most visible and controversial monopoly in America. The legal case was assigned to federal judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who would later become famous as baseball's first commissioner. The trial began in Chicago in 1907 and quickly became one of the most significant legal proceedings in American history. Prosecutors presented extensive evidence documenting Standard Oil's methods, railroad rebates that discriminated against competitors, predatory pricing designed to eliminate rivals, acquisition of competing companies through economic coercion, and systematic coordination among supposedly independent companies to maintain monopoly control. Standard Oil's attorneys countered that the company had achieved success through superior efficiency, that it had reduced kerosene prices dramatically, and that the trust structure had been dissolved in 1892 as Ohio courts had ordered. They argued that Standard Oil companies, while admittedly connected through common ownership and interlocking directorates, operated independently and competed with each other in some markets. The government's evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented internal Standard Oil documents showing explicit discussions of eliminating competitors, maintaining market control, and coordinating activities across the entire corporate network. They called witnesses who described how Standard Oil had crushed their businesses through systematic pressure. They demonstrated that despite the formal trust dissolution, actual operational control had remained unified. One particularly damaging document was an 1881 letter from John D. Rockefeller to a business associate stating, "We are determined to continue the policy of driving out and eliminating competition. The oil trade belongs to those who have the determination and resources to control it." While Rockefeller's attorneys argued the letter was taken out of context and reflected competitive vigor rather than illegal monopolization, it crystallized public perception of Standard Oil's approach. The trial also forced John D. Rockefeller to testify publicly for the first time about Standard Oil's methods. At 68 years old, he appeared frail and struggled to recall specific details about business dealings from decades earlier. His testimony was evasive. He claimed not to remember conversations, denied personal knowledge of specific competitive tactics, and deflected questions by stating that subordinates had handled operational matters. The performance damaged his reputation further. Critics accused him of deliberately feigning memory loss to avoid incriminating himself. Supporters argued he genuinely couldn't recall specific details from years past, and that expecting precise recollection was unreasonable. Regardless of motive, his testimony failed to help Standard Oil's defense and reinforced public perception of the company as secretive and unaccountable. Meanwhile, Ida Tarbell's investigative series in McClure's magazine had been published as a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, in 1904. The book sold widely and became the definitive critical account of Standard Oil's rise. Tarbell documented the railroad rebates, the secret acquisitions, the predatory pricing campaigns, and the personal impact on families whose businesses had been destroyed by Standard Oil's expansion. Her work was meticulously researched, drawing on court records, interviews, internal Standard Oil documents obtained from various sources, and personal accounts from people who had dealt with the company. Tarbell wrote with controlled anger. She acknowledged Standard Oil's operational achievements while condemning its methods as fundamentally unfair and destructive to economic opportunity. The book influenced public opinion powerfully. Middle-class Americans read detailed accounts of how Standard Oil had built its monopoly and concluded that such concentration of economic power was dangerous. Progressive reformers cited Tarbell's work as evidence that major corporations required government regulation. Even some business leaders, worried that Standard Oil's extreme practices were generating anti-business sentiment that threatened all corporations, privately wished the company would be restrained. John D. Rockefeller never publicly responded to Tarbell's book, maintaining his long-standing policy of refusing to engage with critics. Privately, he was stung by the portrayal. He believed genuinely that Standard Oil had improved the oil industry and benefited consumers. He had reduced kerosene prices dramatically, brought order to a chaotic industry, and built an organization of tremendous efficiency. In his view, critics focused on competitive tactics while ignoring the substantive achievements, but public perception was firmly against him. Political cartoons depicted him as an octopus with tentacles strangling small businesses. Newspaper editorials called him a robber baron who had built wealth through manipulation and coercion. Roosevelt explicitly attacked Standard Oil in speeches, describing the company as exemplifying the dangers of unregulated monopoly power. The legal proceedings continued through 1907 and 1908. In August 1907, Judge Landis ruled that Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act and fined the company $29 million, the largest corporate fine in American history at that time. The decision represented a significant victory for government prosecutors and appeared to vindicate the anti-monopoly movement. Standard Oil immediately appealed. The company's attorneys argued that the fine was excessive, that the court had misinterpreted the Sherman Act, and that evidence didn't support finding illegal monopolization. The appeal moved through the federal court system slowly, keeping Standard Oil's ultimate fate uncertain for several more years. During this period, Standard Oil's operational performance remained strong. The company continued refining approximately 85% of American oil, generated enormous profits, and paid dividends that enriched shareholders. But strategic uncertainty created challenges. Should the company invest in new facilities given the possibility of forced dissolution? How should it respond to emerging competitors if future market structure was unpredictable? Gasoline demand was beginning to increase significantly. Automobile production was expanding from a novelty industry into serious manufacturing. Henry Ford's Model T, introduced in 1908, was making automobiles affordable for middle-class consumers. Each car required gasoline to operate, transforming what had been a waste product into an increasingly valuable commodity. Standard Oil was well positioned to capitalize on gasoline demand. Its refineries produced substantial quantities, its distribution network could be adapted for gasoline sales, and its market dominance in kerosene provided foundation for leadership in automotive fuels. But the legal uncertainty complicated strategic planning. If Standard Oil was dissolved, which successor companies would control gasoline distribution? How should investments be allocated across a potentially fragmented corporate structure? John D. Rockefeller was now substantially withdrawn from active management. He spent most of his time at his Florida estate, focusing on philanthropic efforts. He had established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in 1901, which funded scientific research that would eventually produce major medical breakthroughs. He was planning the Rockefeller Foundation, which would become one of the world's largest and most influential philanthropic organizations. His philanthropic approach reflected the same systematic thinking that had built Standard Oil. He didn't simply donate to worthy causes randomly. He studied fields where investment could produce transformative impact, established institutions with clear missions, hired experts to manage operations, and applied disciplined evaluation to measure outcomes. His giving focused particularly on medical research, education, and scientific advancement, areas where he believed systematic investment could generate lasting societal benefits. But philanthropy couldn't rehabilitate his public reputation. Critics argued that no amount of charitable giving could compensate for the wealth accumulated through monopolistic practices. They viewed his philanthropy as an attempt to buy respectability, or, more cynically, as evidence that even Rockefeller recognized his business methods had been ethically questionable. In 1909, Standard Oil's appeal reached the Circuit Court of Appeals, which largely upheld Judge Landis's ruling. The court found that Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act through systematic restraint of trade and monopolistic practices. The fine was reduced on technical grounds, but the core finding against Standard Oil was sustained. Standard Oil appealed to the Supreme Court, setting up the final legal confrontation. The case, Standard Oil Company of New Jersey v. United States, was argued in March 1910. Standard Oil's attorneys contended that the Sherman Antitrust Act had been misinterpreted, that the company's success reflected efficiency rather than illegal conduct, and that forced dissolution would harm consumers by eliminating operational efficiencies. Government attorneys argued that Standard Oil represented exactly the kind of monopolistic combination the Sherman Act was designed to prevent, that the company had systematically eliminated competition through unfair practices, and that dissolution was necessary to restore competitive markets. The Supreme Court deliberated for more than a year. On May 15, 1911, Chief Justice Edward Douglas White delivered the court's decision. The ruling was unanimous. Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act and must be dissolved into separate, independent companies. The court's opinion traced Standard Oil's history from the original Cleveland refinery through the trust formation, the railroad rebates, the predatory pricing campaigns, and the systematic acquisition of competitors. The justices found that Standard Oil's methods constituted unreasonable restraint of trade, and that the company's dominance resulted from unfair, competitive practices rather than superior performance alone. The decision ordered Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, which had served as the holding company for the entire network after the trust's formal dissolution, to divest its ownership stakes in 33 subsidiary companies within 6 months. These companies would become independent entities, ending unified control over the American oil industry. The ruling represented the most significant antitrust enforcement action in American history and established precedents that would shape corporate regulation for decades. It demonstrated that even the most powerful company could be constrained by government action and validated the progressive era belief that monopolies required legal restraint. John D. Rockefeller received news of the decision at his estate in New York. He showed little public reaction. Privately, he maintained that Standard Oil had improved the oil industry and that dissolution would reduce efficiency and potentially raise prices. But he also recognized that fighting further was futile. The legal battle was over. Standard Oil had lost. The empire that had taken 40 years to build would be dismantled within 6 months. The monopoly that had controlled American oil industry more completely than any company controlled any major industry before or since was being broken apart by government order. The question now was what would emerge from the wreckage and whether dissolution would genuinely restore competition or simply create a new corporate structure that maintained the same basic control under different legal arrangements. Legal warfare. The Supreme Court's dissolution order required Standard Oil Company of New Jersey to divest ownership of 33 subsidiary companies within 6 months. The deadline forced the most comprehensive corporate restructuring in American history, breaking apart an integrated industrial empire into legally independent entities. Standard Oil's leadership, now headed by John Archbold with minimal involvement from the semi-retired Rockefeller, approached dissolution strategically. If breakup was inevitable, they would control how it occurred. The goal was creating successor companies that could survive independently while maintaining informal coordination that preserved some of Standard Oil's competitive advantages. The court hadn't specified how to divide assets. Standard Oil had discretion to determine which operations went to which successor company. This allowed strategic allocation designed to create viable entities rather than arbitrary fragmentation that might destroy value. Each successor company received assets that formed coherent regional or functional operations, refining capacity, distribution networks, crude supplies, and supporting infrastructure. Standard Oil of New York, SoConE, received Eastern Seaboard operations, including refineries, distribution facilities, and export terminals. Standard Oil of New Jersey retained some refining capacity and significant crude production assets. Standard Oil of California got Western operations, Continental Oil received mid-continental assets, Atlantic Refining took Pennsylvania operations. Companies that would become Chevron, Amoco, Mobil and others emerged from this division. The allocation created structural advantages for successor companies. They inherited Standard Oil's operational efficiency, refined technology, experienced management, and established market relationships. While legally independent, they shared institutional knowledge, similar corporate cultures, and personal connections among executives who had worked together in the unified organization. Crucially, stock ownership wasn't reorganized. Shareholders in Standard Oil of New Jersey received proportional shares in all successor companies. This meant anyone who owned Standard Oil before dissolution now owned stock in 34 separate companies in identical proportions. John D. Rockefeller, who held approximately 25% of Standard Oil, now held approximately 25% of each successor company. The ownership structure created community of interest that discouraged aggressive competition. If SoConE and Jersey Standard competed intensely, damaging each other's profitability, shareholders in both companies suffered proportionally. Economic incentives favored cooperative behavior that maintained margins rather than destructive price competition that reduced everyone's returns. Critics immediately recognized this problem. The dissolution hadn't genuinely created independent competitors because ownership remained unified. The companies were legally separate but economically aligned through common shareholders. Senator Robert La Follette, a progressive reformer, called the outcome a mockery of antitrust enforcement that preserved Standard Oil's monopoly under different legal structure. The government considered seeking additional remedies to force shareholder diversification, but political appetite for continuing the legal battle was limited. Roosevelt was no longer president. His successor, William Howard Taft, was less committed to aggressive antitrust enforcement. Standard Oil's lawyers argued that ordering shareholders to sell stock would violate property rights and exceed judicial authority. Prosecutors decided to accept the structural dissolution and monitor whether successor companies competed genuinely. Initial signs suggested limited competition. Successor companies generally respected geographic boundaries established during dissolution. SoConE dominated eastern markets. Standard of California controlled the West. Continental operated in Middle America. They didn't aggressively invade each other's territories or engage in price wars that characterized competitive markets. This restraint reflected both common ownership incentives and practical factors. Each company had concentrated infrastructure in specific regions where they possessed advantages. Invading competitors' territories required building new facilities and distribution networks where incumbents held established positions. The capital requirements and risk made aggressive geographic expansion unattractive compared to protecting existing markets. But genuine competition eventually emerged, driven by technological change and market evolution rather than antitrust enforcement. Automobile demand was transforming the oil industry from kerosene focus to gasoline production. Gasoline required different distribution infrastructure, service stations rather than general stores selling kerosene. Companies that established gasoline distribution networks quickly gained advantages in the growing automotive fuel market. Standard Oil's successors approached gasoline differently. Some, like Standard of New Jersey and Saucony, invested aggressively in service station networks. Others focused on refining and wholesale distribution. These strategic differences created diverging business profiles that reduced overlap and eventually fostered genuine competitive differences. New crude oil discoveries in Texas, Oklahoma, and California also disrupted the old Standard Oil system. Massive fields like Spindletop in Texas and the Los Angeles Basin deposits produced crude far from traditional Standard Oil refining centers in the Northeast and Ohio. This created opportunities for independent refiners who built facilities near new production and captured regional markets before Standard Oil successors could extend operations. Gulf Oil, Texaco, and other companies founded by entrepreneurs outside the Standard Oil network grew rapidly in these new regions. They benefited from crude proximity advantages, established regional distribution networks, and cultivated identities as independents fighting against Standard Oil's legacy. By the 1920s, these companies had become significant competitors that Standard Oil successors couldn't easily eliminate. International competition also intensified. Royal Dutch Shell, combining Dutch and British interests, was expanding globally and challenging Standard Oil's export dominance. British Petroleum was developing Middle Eastern oil fields that would eventually produce crude at costs far below American wells. Mexican production was increasing. The international oil industry was becoming genuinely competitive with multiple companies operating in most major markets. These developments would have occurred regardless of Standard Oil's dissolution, driven by technological change, new discoveries, and international competition. But breakup accelerated the transition by preventing unified Standard Oil response to emerging challenges. If Standard Oil had remained intact, it might have used its enormous resources to dominate gasoline distribution, acquire Texas crude production, or establish stronger international positions. As fragmented successors, the companies responded to these opportunities inconsistently, creating openings for new competitors. John D. Rockefeller watched these developments with detachment. At 72 years old in 1911, he had essentially completed his transition from businessman to philanthropist. He spent winters in Florida, summers in New York, played golf daily, and focused almost exclusively on giving away his fortune systematically. His wealth had actually increased significantly because of dissolution. Standard Oil's stock had been artificially depressed during the legal uncertainty. Once dissolution created clear ownership structures and successor companies' assets and capabilities became apparent, stock values rose sharply. The stock Rockefeller held in 34 companies was worth substantially more than his unified Standard Oil holdings had been. By 1913, Rockefeller's personal fortune exceeded $900 million, approaching $1 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum for that era. He was likely the wealthiest individual in world history to that point. Yet he lived modestly, maintaining habits formed during his early years when every penny mattered. He wore suits until they showed wear, ate simple meals, and kept detailed records of household expenses. His philanthropy, however, operated at unprecedented scale. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, received an initial endowment of $100 million and a mandate to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. The foundation funded medical research that helped develop vaccines and treatments for major diseases, supported agricultural research that increased food production in developing countries, and financed educational institutions, particularly for African Americans in the South. The University of Chicago, which Rockefeller had funded generously since the 1890s, became one of America's premier research institutions. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research produced groundbreaking work in virology and pathology. Rockefeller funding helped establish Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, supported medical education across the country, and funded campaigns that eradicated hookworm in the American South. This philanthropy represented perhaps the most successful effort to systematically apply business principles to charitable giving. Rockefeller approached philanthropy like he had approached business, identifying leverage points where investment could produce transformative change, building institutions with clear missions and strong management, measuring outcomes carefully, and adjusting strategies based on results. Yet his public reputation never fully recovered from the Standard Oil controversies. He remained for many Americans the symbol of robber baron capitalism, the man who had built unprecedented wealth through monopolistic practices that crushed competitors and concentrated economic power dangerously. Even his massive philanthropy was viewed suspiciously by critics who saw it as attempting to purchase redemption. Ida Tarbell published her autobiography in 1939, years after Rockefeller's death, and maintained her critical assessment. She acknowledged his philanthropic achievements, but argued that the means through which he had accumulated wealth mattered morally, and that no amount of giving could erase the harm caused by Standard Oil's methods. Many progressives shared this view, seeing Rockefeller as embodying capitalism's worst tendencies regardless of his later generosity. Others offered more nuanced assessments. Some economists argued that Standard Oil had genuinely improved the oil industry's efficiency, that kerosene price reductions had benefited millions of consumers, and that Rockefeller's organizational innovations had advanced industrial management. They acknowledged the monopolistic practices but contended that the net effect had been beneficial compared to the chaotic, wasteful industry that existed before Standard Oil's consolidation. The historical debate continues, reflecting broader disagreements about capitalism, competition, regulation, and the balance between economic efficiency and dispersed opportunity. Standard Oil represents a case study that both critics and defenders of market capitalism invoke, depending on which aspects they emphasize. What's undeniable is that John D. Rockefeller fundamentally shaped American business. He pioneered comprehensive vertical integration, demonstrated the power of systematic cost reduction, showed how control of infrastructure could create competitive advantages, and proved that organizational discipline could matter more than innovation or resources. Every modern corporation that carefully tracks costs, integrates vertically, manages supply chains systematically, or uses scale advantages strategically traces intellectual lineage partly to Standard Oil's methods. He also demonstrated limits to corporate power in a democratic society. Standard Oil's dissolution showed that even the most powerful company could be constrained by political action when public opinion turned decisively against concentrated economic power. The antitrust laws that broke up Standard Oil became templates for competition policy worldwide and continue shaping how markets are regulated. By 1915, the legal warfare had ended. Standard Oil successor companies were operating independently, though with more coordination than antitrust enforcers preferred. New competitors were emerging, particularly in gasoline and international markets. The oil industry was evolving rapidly, driven by automobile demand that was transforming petroleum from an illumination product to a transportation fuel. John D. Rockefeller had won financially, his wealth had increased even through dissolution, but he had lost the broader battle over how his career would be remembered. Standard Oil was broken apart, his business methods were widely condemned, and his reputation remained controversial despite massive philanthropy. The man who believed deeply in rational efficiency had built an empire that society ultimately decided was dangerously powerful regardless of its operational achievements. Empire crumbles November 15, 1911. 6 months after the Supreme Court decision, Standard Oil Company of New Jersey formally completed divestiture of its subsidiary companies. The dissolution was now legally final. What had been one company controlling nearly 90% of American oil refining was now 34 legally independent entities. Financial markets reacted enthusiastically. Standard Oil's stock, which had been depressed during years of legal uncertainty, soared as investors recognized that successor companies inherited valuable assets, established market positions, and operational expertise without the regulatory cloud that had hung over the unified monopoly. Shareholders who had owned one company now held diversified portfolios of related but distinct businesses. John D. Rockefeller's personal holdings increased dramatically in value. His stock in the fragmented companies was worth approximately 50% more than his unified Standard Oil holdings had been worth before the Supreme Court decision. The antitrust action designed to punish monopolistic behavior had inadvertently made the monopolists substantially richer. The irony wasn't lost on critics who had hoped dissolution would curtail Rockefeller's wealth and power. The successor companies began differentiating immediately. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which retained the Standard Oil name and inherited substantial refining capacity and crude production assets, positioned itself as the industry's leading integrated oil company. It invested aggressively in international operations, crude exploration, and refining technology. Coney, operating primarily in New York and New England, focused on distribution and marketing. The company built extensive networks of service stations as gasoline demand grew, establishing brand recognition in the densely populated Northeast. Continental Oil concentrated on Midwestern markets, developing strong positions in states between the Appalachians and Rockies. Standard Oil of California, operating far from Standard Oil's traditional centers, pursued independent strategy most aggressively. The company developed California crude production, built refineries designed for California crude's specific characteristics, and established distribution throughout the western states. It faced less overlap with other Standard Oil successors and competed more directly with Union Oil and other western independents. These strategic differences reflected partly regional market characteristics and partly individual management decisions. The dissolution had separated operations that had been coordinated centrally, requiring each successor company to develop independent strategic planning. Different executives made different assessments about opportunities and threats, creating genuine diversity in how companies approached the oil business. Competition emerged gradually between successors, though less aggressively than antitrust enforcers had hoped. Companies generally respected geographic boundaries established during dissolution. When they did compete directly, it was typically in growing markets where multiple suppliers were viable, rather than direct invasion of competitors' strongholds designed to capture share. Gasoline became the central competitive battleground. As automobile ownership expanded rapidly in the 1910s, gasoline demand outpaced kerosene, transforming industry economics fundamentally. Gasoline distribution required different infrastructure than kerosene, service stations with pumps rather than barrel sales through general stores. Companies that established gasoline distribution networks quickly gained advantages in the rapidly expanding automotive fuel market. Standard Oil successors competed vigorously for service station locations, signed exclusive supply agreements with high-volume stations, and invested heavily in refining capacity optimized for gasoline production rather than kerosene. This competition drove innovation in refining technology, service station design, and marketing approaches that benefited consumers through expanded availability and competitive pricing. Independent oil companies grew substantially during this period, finally able to compete without facing unified Standard Oil's overwhelming advantages. Gulf Oil, headquartered in Pittsburgh, expanded from Texas Gulf Coast crude production into national refining and distribution. Texaco followed similar trajectory, building from Texas production base to national scope. Phillips, Sinclair, and other independents captured meaningful market shares, particularly in rapidly developing markets like California, Texas, and Oklahoma. By 1920, Standard Oil successors collectively controlled approximately 65% of American refining capacity, still dominant but substantially below the 90% that unified Standard Oil had controlled before dissolution. Independent refiners held the remaining 35%, and their share was growing. The dissolution had achieved meaningful though incomplete restoration of competitive markets. International competition intensified even more dramatically. Royal Dutch Shell had become a global rival operating on scale comparable to Standard Oil successors. The company combined Dutch expertise in East Indies production with British capital and marketing networks, creating integrated international operations. Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would become British Petroleum, was developing Middle Eastern fields that began producing crude in quantity during the 1910s. World War I accelerated oil's strategic importance. Militaries mechanized rapidly, replacing horses with motorized vehicles, developing tanks and aircraft, and converting naval vessels from coal to oil propulsion. Oil became essential military resource, elevating petroleum from commercial commodity to strategic necessity that governments viewed as critical to national security. Standard Oil successors supplied Allied militaries during the war, providing fuel that enabled European operations and generating enormous revenues. The companies expanded refining capacity, improved gasoline and lubricant quality for military specifications, and demonstrated logistical capabilities that impressed government officials. These contributions partially rehabilitated the Standard Oil reputation. The companies that had been condemned as monopolistic threats were now recognized as critical contributors to military success. After the war, automobile ownership exploded. Henry Ford's assembly line production had made cars affordable for average Americans. By 1920, there were more than 8 million registered automobiles in the United States, up from approximately 2 million in 1915. Each vehicle required gasoline, motor oil, and other petroleum products, creating sustained demand growth that exceeded even optimistic projections. The demand growth created opportunities for oil companies that had refining capacity, crude supplies, and distribution infrastructure. Standard Oil successors were generally well-positioned, though they faced growing competition from independents and international companies. The market was expanding rapidly enough that multiple companies could grow simultaneously without direct zero-sum competition. John D. Rockefeller observed these developments from increasing distance. By 1915, he was 76 years old and had substantially withdrawn from public life. He maintained investments in Standard Oil successors and other companies but had no operational involvement. His focus was philanthropy, golf, and time with family. His health had declined significantly. Years of stress during Standard Oil's expansion and legal battles had taken toll. He suffered from digestive problems that limited his diet to bland foods. His hair had fallen out completely due to alopecia, leading him to wear wigs in public. He moved slowly, tired easily, and kept a schedule built around rest and routine. But his mind remained sharp, and he followed Standard Oil successors' progress carefully. He tracked stock prices, read industry reports, and occasionally offered observations to former colleagues who visited. His primary concern was ensuring his philanthropy had lasting impact. He worked with advisors to establish endowments structured to survive indefinitely, fund institutions that would continue operating after his death, and create philanthropic infrastructure that would deploy his wealth effectively across decades. The Rockefeller Foundation was making extraordinary progress. By 1920, it had funded medical research that contributed to developing treatments for diseases that killed millions annually. It had supported agricultural research that increased crop yields, particularly in developing countries where food scarcity threatened populations. It had established medical schools and public health programs across the American South, regions that had lacked adequate healthcare infrastructure. Rockefeller's philanthropy ultimately distributed approximately $550 million during his lifetime, equivalent to tens of billions in modern currency. Additional hundreds of millions flowed to charitable causes after his death through endowments he had established. The scale of giving was unprecedented, and the systematic approach to philanthropy influenced how other wealthy individuals and families approached charitable giving. Yet even this extraordinary generosity couldn't fully rehabilitate his public image. For many Americans, John D. Rockefeller remained primarily associated with Standard Oil's monopolistic practices rather than his philanthropy. Political cartoonists still depicted him as a grasping monopolist. History textbooks described him as the archetypal robber baron. His business methods overshadowed his charitable contributions in popular memory. The Standard Oil successor companies gradually distanced themselves from the Rockefeller name and Standard Oil legacy. Some adopted new brand identities. Socony became Mobil, Continental became Conoco, Standard of California became Chevron, Jersey Standard became Exxon. These rebranding efforts reflected partly marketing considerations. The Standard Oil name carried negative associations, and partly legitimate corporate evolution as companies developed distinct identities decades after dissolution. By 1925, the oil industry looked substantially different than it had when Standard Oil was dissolved in 1911. Successor companies still held significant market positions but faced genuine competition from multiple sources. Gasoline had replaced kerosene as the primary petroleum product. International markets were dominated by several major companies rather than Standard Oil's former near monopoly. New crude sources in the Middle East, Venezuela, and elsewhere were diversifying supply beyond American fields that Standard Oil had dominated. The dissolution had achieved meaningful though incomplete restoration of competitive markets. Standard Oil's monopoly was broken. New competitors had emerged and thrived. Innovation in refining, distribution, and products had accelerated with multiple companies pursuing different strategies. Consumers benefited from competitive pricing and expanded service. But concentrated market power hadn't been eliminated entirely. Oil remained an industry characterized by large, integrated companies with substantial market shares and significant barriers to entry. The successor companies, while legally independent and genuinely competing in most respects, collectively maintained dominant positions that gave them advantages over smaller competitors. The industry structure was more competitive than Standard Oil's monopoly, but less competitive than fully fragmented markets. The tension between economic efficiency and dispersed competition that Standard Oil represented remained unresolved. Large integrated companies achieved operational efficiencies that benefited consumers through lower costs. But concentrated economic power created risks of abuse and raised concerns about unequal competitive conditions. This tension would continue shaping oil industry regulation and competition policy throughout the 20th century. Standard Oil's empire had crumbled as a legal entity but survived in fragmented form through successor companies that remained industry leaders decades later. The dissolution represented significant antitrust enforcement success and demonstrated that government could constrain even the most powerful monopolies, but it also revealed limits to structural remedies when ownership remained unified and when competitive advantages derived from operational capabilities that survived corporate reorganization.